Hello and welcome to The Breakdown. I'm Tara Lynch, and today's topic is fueling the race for the White House, socioeconomic class, and election 2020. So we'll be breaking down how the media covered socioeconomic class throughout this election cycle. So let's jump right on in. So we're going to start with a definition of class, and it can be a little tricky to understand because class can mean a bunch of different things, but in this context, we'll be talking about a group sharing the same economic or social status. So here, journalists generalize these groups in order to show certain trends about how people are going to vote, or they'll contextualize it to show how people voted in the past. So this election cycle, we heard a lot about what classes voted for which candidate in 2016 and how those groups might vote in 2020. So we'll analyze that further as we move forward here to some common terms used when discussing class. So obviously we have class itself, low income, rural or urban, working class, elites, middle class, and the 1%. Now these are just examples, things that we were looking for when we were doing this study to see what terms were being used and who was being talked about. But another kind of concept on this is these are just base terms. So when you add in words like suburban white women, that's combining class with gender with race. So class is really used as kind of a base terminology with other terms on it to really generalize and give these demographic groups that journalists tend to use when covering elections. And we look at 4 years ago and what happened and what was being covered, and it was a lot about disenfranchised versus disenchanted. So disenfranchised is the state of being deprived of a right or privilege, especially the right to vote. Disenchanted, the feeling of disappointment about someone or something you previously respected. So these two terms were discussed when talking about the rural vote, the rural white vote in particular, and how that would affect the election. Ultimately, the media decided that that vote in particular launched President Trump into the White House. So this was important to kind of take a look at this time. Did the media go with the same approach, or did they change which classes they were focusing on or how they spoke about that particular class? There's also a blame on rural America, as I just mentioned, so that Democrats forgot about the working class, forgot about the rural strongholds, forgot about those people, so they swung to vote for President Trump. And the media, by blaming rural America, the media fell into the trap of President Trump. So they blamed his supporters, and thus he could attack them, and it kind of created that relationship that we saw throughout the Trump administration. And then we also have media elitism, which there was a lack of connection of the reporters with the people on the ground who they were reporting on. So back in 2016, nobody really went on the ground to see why rural America maybe was generally voting for President Trump, or why the working class Americans generally decided to vote for President Trump. There were just these general analyses without any contextual on the ground information. So we're going to see if that changed this year as well. And as we move forward, these are topics that we covered in 2016 that we want to keep in mind. There was a lot about polling, so we really looked at those polls that were created by pollsters and statisticians, and we didn't really do some of our own reporting. The media didn't really cover other things besides polls, and polls are just numbers. We really need to talk to people on the ground. There are also socioeconomic generalizations, as we just went over, and big hot button issues were taxes and the economy. So who was going to get higher taxes, who wasn't, and how is the economy going to move forward and grow or regress? And ultimately they ended up voting for President Trump, generally the working class, the rural class, because of the economy, and taxes. So these are the two networks that we really looked at, Fox News and CNN. They are two opposing networks in terms of their political views, and that's why I thought it was important to take a look at these two. They also have one of the highest audiences for political coverage. So again, a lot of people are turning to either of these networks to receive their political news. So it's important, and they have a lot of impact on how the American public is viewing class. So this is our data collection process. First, gathered a ton of articles, so 44 from CNN, 29 from Fox News. That is just based on what we could find using our search database, Nexus Uni, and searching for things like election 2020 and class, election 2020 working class, election 2020 frontline workers, things like that to get these stories that were ultimately about class. Then we analyzed the reporting, so we used key terms to decode what was being said, terms like urban, rural, class, working class, of course, worker, frontline worker, even things about elites, which was pretty low being discussed this time. It was a lot about the working class, especially amid the COVID-19 pandemic. But using these key terms to kind of see what was being discussed, what issues were being discussed, and how they were being discussed. And then we drew conclusions, which we will get to at the end. So we're going to start with CNN and this graph. So this kind of tells you where these articles fell. And we didn't do it by article. We did it more so based on mentions. So some of the things that we found were CNN transcripts. So those are from certain segments of shows and things like that. So they may not have been just about the working class or just about the economy. They may have been intermixed throughout. So we counted it based on kind of the mentions of these topics rather than the singular articles themselves. So there's a very little amount about polling with the CNN collection. There's a lot about voter turnout, which I'll get to in a minute. A little bit about issues. That was the second highest category, so issues like the economy, taxes, and things like that. And then a little bit about Trump, President Trump, what he was saying, more about Biden and what he was saying using direct quotes from Biden or the Biden campaign, and other, there were two articles that kind of didn't fit these categories, so we threw them in that category. Now, voter turnout. This was a huge topic for CNN, kind of talking about class in terms of who was going to come out and vote, when these people were going to vote. Remember, we had mail-in voting, we had early voting in a lot of states for the first time, and we had day of voting. So CNN's coverage throughout the election season was about voter turnout and when these people were voting. They are a left-leaning network, so a lot of their viewers maybe voted by mail. The mail-in vote heavily favored Democrats in this election, so it's very, very possible that that is why they were focused on that. They were also focused on these different types of voter turnout because there was a lot of discussion about the working class and frontline workers and how these people were going to be able to vote while they were working. Not everybody works from home, although a lot of people do, a lot of people in the middle class do, but not everybody in America. So that was what CNN was focusing on, how people could vote during this election. And here we have some quotes that were from the CNN articles or the transcripts. So this one, not even with white working class men, it's even shrinking there. So yes, they may overall still support Donald Trump, but by a smaller margin. Same thing with white working class women. Every other demographic is moving away from the Republican Party, particularly suburban white women. So this was from a political contributor at CNN, and this was a heavily discussed topic, suburban women and how they were going to vote. Generally, in 2016, the media told us that they swung for Republicans and Donald Trump. This time, the focus was on suburban women swinging the other way for Biden, amid many different issues, including the COVID-19 pandemic, unemployment, the economy, taxes, all of those good things that we talked about before. So again, we see here the generalizations: white working class women, suburban women, working class men. So this is a conversation about class using a lot of different terms and ways of depicting demographics and class. But also, one thing to note is it's very, very specific. It's talking about just really one or two very specific demographics. It is not really sharing much information about other areas. There was less on the CNN coverage about the Latino working class, for example, or the black working class, for example. So there was a lot of focus on white suburban women, which is very, very interesting in and of itself. And moving forward, another quote from the CNN Wire says, "I am tired of it, and I'm not going to sit back and let it happen anymore." This was from a source that they interviewed about the downturn in rural America and farming that is shifting to larger and larger corporate farms. So they actually went on the ground in a CNN Wire article. There were two articles like this that had quotes from people directly on the ground, two rural farmers, both of them men, And it was very interesting that in those two particular articles on The Wire, they weren't in the transcripts from their shows, this was on the CNN Wire service, that's where these quotes got to go. So we need more reporting like this to really understand why rural America maybe swung a different direction than they did 4 years ago. This provides a lot of information and a lot of context instead of just relying on data and numbers. Fox News, a little bit of a different graph here, so we'll go through it. A little bit about polling, not really a lot about it in this election cycle. Voter turnout, again, this was, I believe, the second highest category, so a little bit there, but not as much as CNN. They focused a lot on the issues, primarily taxes and the economy. The idea that the Biden campaign was going to raise your taxes and the Trump campaign was not going to raise your taxes. So this was targeted particularly at the middle class, particularly at low-income families, maybe working-class families, and then also sharing how the economy would rebound amid the COVID-19 pandemic. That was another stronghold for the Trump administration and something that Fox News really focused on in order to share and target specific classes who would be kind of paying more attention to how the economy rises and falls on a more daily basis. A lot about Trump and what Trump was saying and quotes from the president, a little bit less about Biden, mostly criticizing him and his policy and his issues, and a couple of other mentions about class that didn't quite fit into these major categories here. Voter turnout, they talked about it less, I think because there was less emphasis from the Republicans and from the Trump administration about early voting or mail-in voting. It was a lot more about day of voting. So they were more focused on the issues and how those issues would affect particular class groups. So some quotes here. This is from a Fox News host. What are your hopes and fears if Trump gets 4 more years? If he is re-elected Tuesday, here's what we might see: lower taxes, rebounding economy, continued lower unemployment. And he went on to list a couple of more issues, but those, while class isn't mentioned directly in this quote, these things really go towards the middle class, the working class, people who are concerned about unemployment, concerned about the economy going down again, concerned about their taxes going up, and it doesn't really mention class here at all, but it does in an indirect way, in a very subtle way. And then this is a quote from the president that was aired on Fox News, talking about suburban women and issues about things that are destroying the suburbs. And he's, again, here targeting a very specific group of women, specific class of women who have certain concerns. And this quote aired on the network is an indirect representation of Fox and their stance because they're airing it. So they're really pigeonholing and directing their analysis towards a specific group of people. So 4 years later, what did we see? What did we learn? A lot about taxes, a lot about the economy. That was the main issue that was discussed. A lot about the economic crash that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. Tax cuts versus tax increase, so comparing what both campaigns were saying about taxes and whether they would increase them or decrease them, or who would be affected and what socioeconomic groups would be affected by a tax increase or a tax cut. The impact of COVID-19, this was very important. There were a lot of people who are unemployed in this country, falling into a specific socioeconomic class. There are a lot of frontline workers, again, falling into a specific socioeconomic class. A lot of people working from home as well. So there's really a lot happening in terms of jobs and income that are very different and new, frankly, for an election cycle. And then again, the disenchantment of voters was another topic that was briefly addressed more indirectly this time. And voter turnout replaced polling as one of the main sources of socioeconomic class analysis. Mail-in voting versus early voting, kind of deciding who would vote when and why and for whom and how. So overall grade, I would give the media average. I would say overall it was a C. Generalizations about class were very prevalent. There was very little on the ground reporting about class, about issues pertaining to certain socioeconomic classes. So that is a recommendation that I'll get to in a little bit. Voter turnout, again, as we mentioned, that was a huge topic, but no real discussion on the ground. Why were you voting a specific way? Did it pertain to your socioeconomic class? Did it not? And the issues regarding socioeconomic classes, again, were pretty general, surrounding the pandemic, surrounding taxes, and the economy. There were a few moments talking to people on the ground, which is better than none, but we definitely need more to really contextualize and understand what is going on. And finally, there was a lot of focus on rural versus urban, working class, suburban versus working class, and using race and gender mixed in to kind of create these demographics and generalize certain classes of people, and without, really that context that we were just talking about. So recommendations, we need to focus on where the camera is pointed. So get out of the studio to understand. Now, amid a global pandemic, that has its challenges, of course. So figuring out a way to do that in a safe way, an innovative way, using Zoom perhaps, or another software that we can interact with people virtually. Focusing this year, there was a lot of focus on the vote, how people were going to vote, of course. So didn't really show much about how citizens would participate in this process. So there was a lot of discussion about, we have mail-in voting, here are the issues surrounding it, or we have early voting, here are the issues surrounding it, here are people are counting. But we didn't really know how certain classes of people would be affected by these types of votes. So that would be an interesting angle to take as well. And didn't really show a variety of social classes. There was a lot of focus on the middle class, suburban women in particular. So kind of branching out and going beyond our source list to develop new areas and new voices and new stories. And finally, talking to people on the ground. I think that's probably the biggest point here, is talking to people on the ground, because that's where the stories are, that's where the context is. That's where we really learn what issues are important, how people will vote, and that also informs the numbers that we're getting and the data journalism that we're getting. Speaking to people, see how this year affected them, see what can be done better, and then share the demographic reporting after that. So using that as a means to inform and back up the claims that journalists are making via data journalism. All right, that's all the time we have today on The Breakdown. Thank you so much for watching this episode about socioeconomic class. I'm Tara Lynch, and we'll see you next time.